This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
Welcome to the OI podcast, the Otago Institute podcast, in-depth conversations with experts from the worlds of arts, sciences and Mātauranga Māori, brought to you by the Otago Institute, the Otago branch of the Royal Society for Arts and Sciences. Kia ora, I'm Dr. Barb, and today in the studio we have a museum curator, Peter Reid, from Toitu Museum, the Otago Settlers Museum, and this is the second or maybe the third, depends on which order you're listening to the podcasts in our intermittent miniseries on Transport Modeshift. So today we're looking at early European land transport, and there was a lot of mode shift in that time, and we're going to try and explore as much as we can of the 1800s and the early 1900s. And welcome, Peter Reid. Thank you very much for coming along.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Museum curator. So I'm just gonna let everybody know the expertise that we have in the room here. So you're originally from the Waitaki.
Yeah, grew up in Oamaru, yep.
Grew up in Oamaru, and then BA Hons in History here at the Otago University, and then followed by a Master in History, and then a Diploma in Museum Studies all the way out at Massey.
Yep, extramurally.
Oh, right. So obviously, because it was they actually
back in the day, yeah.
Back in the day, they used to do a lot of correspondence type stuff, didn't they?
They did.
Yeah. So very much a locally grown hero for transport here.
I don't know about hero. I also don't like the word expert because we tend to be generalists in the museum.
That's right. You can be an expert generalist just the same. So the kind of, I don't know if I've even told the listeners out there, but the idea of the OI podcast is that every week we get an expert in something to come along and talk about what they're an expert in and just share their knowledge and their education, because that's kind of the brief behind the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences, is just sharing and encouraging knowledge and education in all its forms, arts, sciences and Mātauranga Māori. And today we're here to talk about something that you know a lot about and you've studied a lot about, even if it's at a generalist. I think it's more his humbleness here. You get that with curators all the time. But you do know a lot about the subject that we're talking to today, early European land transport.
I've just been working in the area for a long time.
Yeah, that's fine. So, how long have you been at Toitu, at the Otago Settlers Museum?
Coming up 24 years.
Yeah, see, that's a long time. And the exhibition On the Move, that's a permanent exhibition there, but it has had a recent refresh.
Yeah, reopened again the end of last year.
And how does that work? Why do you decide to do a free fresh? Do you get new things in, or was it just outdated? How does that all work?
After it's been up for a while, it needs a bit of tarting up. Yeah, change is a good thing.
Change is a good thing.
We're going to be talking a lot about change, aren't we?
Yeah, we are. It's all about change today, and of course that's a free. It's a free exhibition. I don't think there's anything that you pay for except through your rates at the Toitu.
Yep.
Yeah, so it has quite a nice diversity there of kind of genealogy stuff. I love the dresses. I love all those beautiful Victorian dresses and right through. But I also love the modern stuff. The kind of retro modern stuff, like the kitchenware and things that go through all the decades.
Nostalgia area, really. It's stuff people can remember.
Yeah, how your grandma's kitchen used to look, yep. and you can go round there and go, oh, we used to have one of those. That's what we had at home when I was a kid, And I love that part of it as well. But I really like the whole maritime bit with the ships in there, and they've redone the Start exhibition with the whole Maori exhibition with the house and all of the boats and everything in there very nicely. And I'm hoping that we can get someone to come along and talk to water transport and that pre-European water transport later on in the series. But today we are focusing just on land transport. And land transport in those the Europeans. So the first Europeans, I guess, arrived on big ships, big sailing ships. They came here, they got to land, and they were largely walking.
They were, yeah.
And then at some point, I guess, they brought horses with them.
Well, yeah. One of the first things that happened was the provincial surveyor in 1858 made a bit of a speech in the schoolhouse, and he said, one of the things we need, we're doing really well, but one of the things we need is better roads.
Right. When you
to
say
the south and to the north.
When you say the schoolhouse, you mean Dunedin schoolhouse?
Yeah, just in the centre of town. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yep. Or village it was then.
Right.
And of course, very muddy streets and things back then too.
I imagine.
But the reason he wanted to have major roads north and south was so that they could run a mail coach, because mail was very important. And we often think about transport and communication going hand in hand, or we used to. It's a bit more divorced these days with the digital era, but yeah.
But I mean, it's an important driver, right?
It was.
Driver.
Yeah.
I'm so full of puns today.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, it's true. Like one of the big things back then about transport was communication, and transport and communication were the same thing. So we're talking about 1858.
1858, he made that observation that they needed these roads, and he eventually got 400 blokes making the road to the south. And
wow, how did he get 400 blokes making a road?
Oh, I guess there were plenty of willing hands in those days.
Right, okay.
So they made the road to the south, and a mail coach, Julie, was imported from Scotland.
Right.
And a guy called James McIntosh started running the coach down south.
And when you say down south, how far are we talking there to the Clutha?
To the Clutha, yeah.
To the Clutha River?
Yeah.
Right, and then on the river it would just go by boat, did it? Or?
They had to use a lot of river punts and things back in the day before the bridges were built.
Right.
And some listeners may still remember punts being used around the region until more recent times.
Right. So that's the road south from Dunedin over Lookout Point or down the Kauri Valley there?
So as they're going over Saddle Hill, that was one of the more difficult parts. And, of course, then you have to get through the swampy areas as well.
Yeah. And I imagine South Dunedin was still quite swampy back then as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then heading all the way down to what's now Clutha.
Yep.
And then stopping there.
Yep.
And then from there, if you wanted to get mail to Invercargill or Bluff, you would go by boat, I guess.
Yeah. So that was the way to get places before the roads were formed, of course, was to go along the coast.
Yeah.
But then a major change happened because you think about the transport icons in the museum, one of the things you think of is the Cobb & Co coach.
Right. Big out the front, it's got those model horses, which look fantastic.
Yeah. That's a gold rush story, obviously.
Yeah.
That's the part of our narrative, the museum narrative, where we have the coach situated.
Yeah. And that's the first thing I thought was, are we talking about I didn't even think about transport prior to the gold rush, but that's actually, there is the best part of a decade almost. Of European.
No, it was 1860 when the mail coach arrived, and then the gold rushes start in the middle of 61.
All right, so there's not that long actually.
And a guy called Charles Cole, who was a Cobb & Co coach proprietor in Australia, saw an opportunity here because the coaching was winding down a wee bit in Australia because
as the gold was winding down.
Well, because rail was taking over.
Right.
And so he saw an opportunity here, brought a coach and some carts and 54 horses on a ship.
54 horses.
Yep.
So he brought the horses with him.
Yep.
So do you know when the first horses came to Dunedin?
Not off the top of my head. No.
There's no reason why you should know that off the top of your head. Just, you seem to know everything.
Like I said, not an expert. Generalist.
Carry on.
Yeah, so and he set up service to the goldfields
right.
To Gabriel's Gully.
Right, and so that was going around through Lawrence there.
Yep.
To so Gabriel's Gully.
They go south, so they were competing with James McIntosh, and eventually James McIntosh ended up working for Cobb & Co.
Oh, right. Got bought out.
Yeah. And, so they'd have changing stations along the way where they change the horses and stop for rest.
Right. And so would they just run, how long does it take to get from Dunedin to Lawrence on a Cobb & Co coach? Because I'm imagining you're on a fairly rough road then, right? It's a formed road, but it's still a gravel, muddy track, right?
It varied over time. There's quite a famous account of a guy who came here. He was an English solicitor, and he was on a sort of an overseas adventure, and he wrote about it afterwards. So he arrived in town 1862, New Year's Day.
Right.
And he was looking for a place to stay, so he went to the Provincial Hotel, managed to get there. It was like 2:30 in the morning.
Right. Why?
Couldn't find a bed because it was New Year's Eve.
Right, of course, yeah.
He ended up getting a bed which was basically a plank and a blanket out in a shed.
In the stable? Isn't that what happened?
In a shed, yeah. and he had two bedfellows with him as well.
Right, yeah.
And then he had about 2.5 hours sleep, and they had to get up and catch the coach at 5:30.
Right.
Which left from the hotel, from the Provincial
Hotel.
Yeah.
Where was the Provincial Hotel?
Where it kind of still is. So the corner of Mant Street and Stafford Street.
Oh, am I going crazy? I don't know.
I think it's a backpackers these days. Isn't it?
Oh, yeah, no, I know what you mean.
It was a hotel in my day.
Right, yeah. No, I know what you mean. I do know. It's like, I do know what you mean. Yeah, carry on.
Yeah, and so off he went, and they spent the day getting to. He actually got off and stayed in Waitahuna.
Right.
But it was a bit of an epic trip because the weather was pretty bad, and it started to thunder and lightning and hail, and they were very wet by the time they got there. And then
he must have thought he'd got to the wrong hemisphere.
And as they're going over the mountainous bits, the driver would call out, "Everybody out to windward." And so everybody would sort of lean across and they'd have their heads sticking out the side of the coach to make sure it didn't topple over on the steep bits. And
right.
And then so he spent the night in Waitahuna, and then got on the coach again to go home. And,
he didn't carry on his journey.
He didn't go all the way to Gabriel's Gully, no.
Right. Just sightseeing to Waitahuna.
Yeah, so you'd have to allow a day to get there and a day to come back.
Right. Yeah.
And on the way back, there was only one other passenger, and it was a woman who, every time they went over a bump, she'd hit her head on the top of the coach, and I think she was a wee bit tipsy, and she was sort of yelling every time she hit her head.
It sounds like an epic journey. Oh, goodness. Right, so that's the coaches. And you're talking there about the horses and them bringing 50, 54, 52 horses with them. And I was asked, I looked through some of the notes, and I was amazed. One of the coaches took 27, 30 people, something along, it seemed an enormous number of people to put in a coach. Like when I look at those pictures of those coaches, I think 6, when you look at Bridgerton,
yeah,
you think, how many people fits in a coach? I don't know, 6, 7, 8 at a squish, maybe a couple sitting on the top, one on the back. But when you start to get more than, honestly, 10 people on a coach, how many horses do you need to pull that? Plus the weight of the coach. If you've got a coach that's, is that true, that 27?
By the time Cobb & Co was sold, they had 13 coaches, and the biggest was about 27-seater, I think. And
what kind of road surface does that go all the way through?
I'm not sure which routes they used that particular one on, but
have you any idea how many horses are needed to pull a 27-person coach, or how big it is?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I guess it would depend on the terrain and that sort of thing too, and how many times they changed the horses, and
right, whether they're fresh or not. Because I imagine they had sort of a day's travel, and then there'd be a small township there, and the people would get off and they'd change the horses, and then the coach would move on. But of course, it was not so much about the transport of the people; it was about the mail getting through, and I guess to Gabriel's Gully to getting the gold back to be sold.
Yep. Well, initially they had a specific gold escort with troopers supporting it, but
so that people didn't hold up the coach or something.
And later on, it did come back by coach with on the Cobb & Co coaches.
Right, but still with an escort and some sort of a locked box or something.
Depending on how long the journey was, it would be in a strong box, and it was put under the seat at the front, and the policeman sat on top of it and guarded it all the way. But if it was an overnight, they might have 2 policemen with it, so that they could take turns watching it overnight. Yeah,
interesting, eh? Yeah, well, it kind of makes sense, right? Because you wouldn't want individual people to have to carry their little bit of gold all the way back to Dunedin. They would want...
Well, it was sold to the banks and then
the
transported
bank
to
would bring
Dunedin.
it, yeah. So the bank would be at the goldfield.
Yep.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so Cobb and Co. So they sort of came in pretty much the same time as the gold rush
Yep.
was starting. And without the gold rush, do we think that Cobb and Co. would have been there, or?
Oh, well, I guess some
because the Balclutha trip with Macintosh, that was happening before the gold, without them having known that there was gold there, right?
There were other companies too.
There were other companies.
But Cobb and Co certainly became the largest and tried to run the others off the road.
Right. Oh, gosh. Did they literally run them off the road?
Well, yeah. They tried to, pinch their drivers and that sort of thing, yeah.
Oh, right. Interesting. And that went through to Lawrence, and then from Lawrence, I guess they then did the tricky part through Roxburgh and over to the Dunstan goldfields.
Yeah, well, after the Dunstan gold rushes broke out, then they started going over the mountain track, so like what we call the old Dunstan Road these days. And so that was the end of 1862. And then, of course, in 1863 we get the big snowfall.
Right.
And things got really perilous up there. It was a heck of a journey. There's tales of the drivers running into snowdrifts and the horses getting buried and the passengers having to help dig them out. And on one occasion that happened, and then they got another mile down the road, it happened again.
Right, yeah.
And so they eventually gave up running on that route, and they instead they went over the pig route to the north.
Do you know why the pig route's called the pig route? I always imagined there was pigs there.
Named after the place in the centre of the route. Yeah,
that was called the pig route.
Yeah, it's called pig route. Yeah,
but do we know what? Was it because of pigs?
I always forget the story. I think it was Turnbull Thompson, the surveyor, named it. I think.
Right. Yeah, and there was a place called Pig Rouge.
Yep, and there was the hotel there because it was a 2-day journey along that route, so there was a hotel in the middle, and two coaches used to meet.
And swap and go back the other way.
Yeah.
And I guess they'd have refreshed horses there, and people could get off and stretch their legs and then get back on.
Two of the most famous drivers worked on that route, so Harry Nettlefold and Ned Devine.
Right.
He's the most well-known driver in Otago. And he'd come from Victoria. Well, they'd both come from Victoria. They were both Tasmanian-born.
Right.
And they'd left there again because the railroad had basically, the work had dried up.
Right. And then,
but Ned had become really famous driving what was called the Leviathan coach, which was a massive coach in Australia.
Right. That
could hold 48 people or something like that.
Right. I mean, I guess Australia a little bit flatter.
Yeah.
A little bit longer. But yeah, the Leviathan coach. So, right, so they came here, and he was famous because he was driving this big Leviathan coach, or for misdemeanors?
He'd made a name for himself over there, and he just became one of the most familiar faces here. Yeah,
right. Going through to Dunstan, and then from Dunstan, did they carry on the Cobb and Co? I mean, Dunstan sort of Alex Clyde there, where it is now, but then did he carry on into Queenstown, the Arrow, following
all sorts of interconnected routes and different companies, and yeah.
But all sort of ad hoc. There was no overriding kind of Otago Regional Council. We said routes to go here. They just
very
kind
private.
of everything was all private and just sort of formed where it was ad hoc.
And it was quite expensive too. That's one of the things that really surprised me. Us Australians kind of like to take the dollar value of things and then plug it into the Reserve Bank inflation calculator and work out what it would cost.
Right. Okay. Oh no, that's interesting. So, I'd love to do that.
So a trip to the Dunstan at the height of the gold rushes at 63 cost you about £5.
Right. And how much is that
and
today?
In today's money, that's over $700.
Oh wow. So that's someone who's really quite well to do. And I imagine someone who's wearing 1860s, they are quite big gowns, full length, with quite a big crinoline still, 1860s.
You'd be always hiking them out of the mud.
Yeah, they'll be right down in the mud. You could have reasonably sensible boots on, I imagine, underneath them, because you couldn't really see the boots, but a tight bodice and stays, or possibly even a corset by then. So I imagine that walking there as a, wife of the banker or something, would be quite out of the question. So they would be the people taking the coach, I guess. And I guess the gender ratio on those this is completely straying off of land transport, but I guess the gender ratio was quite skewed on those goldfields.
It certainly was.
And most of the people getting there were just walking with a swag over their back or something, or maybe with a pack horse.
Yep. A lot of walking was done on those days, so they must have been a lot fitter than us.
Yeah, and there must have been a lot of people walking on that, like that track itself must have been quite busy, people walking it, because if it takes 2 days to get there on a coach, I imagine by walking it's best part of a week.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. Anyway, so
and
still...
it was quite a dangerous way to travel too at times. I mean...
The coach.
Yeah. Cause
I imagine that with the mail, with the pressure to get there on time, I imagine that they were really travelling at some speed.
Well, not necessarily, because the mud was the worst thing.
Right.
You get bogged down in the mud, and then the coach turns over, or breaks an axle or something. It holds you up for a while. Yeah. And one of the most tragic accidents was on the South Road. When I think he was a storekeeper down in Balclutha maybe, and he'd gotten married in Dunedin, and he was returning to Balclutha with his new wife, and the coach overturned and he was killed.
Oh gosh, that's a short marriage, isn't it?
It was.
Wow, I know that is kind of tragic, isn't it? Because he only came here to get married, and she lived. Yep. Do you know what happened with her?
No, I haven't traced her actually.
Oh.
And then some of the drivers met sticky ends too. I mean, James McIntosh, later on in his career, he was working one of the last routes, which was between Lawrence and Roxburgh. Right. And the coach got away from him, and the king bolt broke, and so the coach separated and he got thrown off, and he was unconscious, and he eventually died. So after all those years being the number one man of coaching, tragic end to his career.
Tragic end to his career. Although, I mean, you can sort of say as well, maybe he died doing what he loved.
Absolutely.
You can look at those things all the ways. But I imagine that stretch between Lawrence and Roxburgh, I mean, and Roxburgh and Dunstan across there, that never had rail through there, did it?
Well, that's why they were the routes that survived the longest. Because it was competition from
the rail that shifted that train, and that was because it was secure and it was fast and it was it just went there and you didn't have to worry about getting stuck in the mud, I guess. Yep. But that rail line went, of course, through basically following the pig route there, because that's where the Otago Rail Trail is now. So
that's when we get the second, so the first major shift in modes of transport is with the coaches, I guess.
Yeah,
in the 1860s.
So that's moving from everybody having to walk anywhere that you go, and that means that the people who are in a place are only the ones who were able to walk there, and pack horses and stuff. And then you get that first shift, which is, as you're saying,
into rail in the 1870s. So they'd actually started planning for rail in the 1860s, but started building the rail to the south of Dunedin in the early 1870s, opened it 1875.
Which is remarkably quick, really, when you think about the speed that things were happening. Because we started here with, 1858. Yep. They're saying in the schoolhouse, hey, we need a decent road here. Yep. Let's build a road.
And then a few years later, they're saying, let's build railways.
So, sort of 1858 through to the Gold Rush 61, and you've got your Cobb and Co's going lots of different directions, because I imagine they're not just going south, they go north as well. The Cobb and Co's up to Oamaru and Ashburton, Timaru, heading up that way. And then you've got the rail coming in already, being built and running in 1875. So
75 to the south, 77 they went to Lawrence, 78 the railroad to the north opened, 79 they start building the Otago Central Railway.
Right. So that's a lot of rail to be putting down in a very short time. I mean, considering how long it took to build the shared path from St Leonard's to Port Chalmers, that's considerably longer than the entire time it took to plan and build all the railways in Otago.
Yep. And of course, I've forgotten the Dunedin to Port Chalmers Railway, which was the first.
Yeah, now,
And
am
of
I
course,
right in saying
Josephine.
that that's the first railway line in New Zealand?
No.
No, oh damn! I've been telling people that all over. It's definitely the first in around Dunedin, though.
Yep,
Was the
yep,
Port Chalmers
yep.
to Dunedin, because I was there when they had the big celebration for the anniversary of the Josephine coming, and it came on the name of the boat. I've temporarily forgotten it.
The Wave Queen, was it?
No. Oh, I've forgotten the name of the boat. Anyway, it came with all of the Polish immigrants that came on the Palmerston. No. Oh, totally forgotten. It's gone out of my brain. Sorry, listeners out there. Anyway, all the Polish immigrants that came on the same boat, and they came with the Josephine over, and then that group, there was a lot of engineers there and a lot of people who could only speak Polish, so it was very hard for them to work on isolated farms around the place because of the communication barrier. But as a group, they largely were responsible for building that railway from Port Chalmers through to Dunedin, that the Josephine that they'd come on the boat with came through. Anyway, rail.
Yes.
Talk to us about rail.
Well, and of course we've got rail in Dunedin itself as well, because we've got the beginning of the tramway system.
And is that contemporary? That's the same time. That's
1879, the first horse tram went from the Exchange down Castle Street to the Water of Leith.
Because that's quite late, really, isn't it? Is that
not especially? No.
Well, I'm just thinking that because how are people getting around in Dunedin before that? Like between 1858 and 1879,
walking,
horse and cart. Right, so there's no sort of public transport at all then. You either have your own horse and cart,
yep,
or you're walking to somewhere. And I guess Dunedin obviously was much smaller at the time, but still, it was quite a big city for New Zealand at the time. It was, I would imagine, the biggest city in New Zealand after the gold rush started, because this is where everything was happening. Everyone was coming here, if not to be specifically looking for the gold, then in support of the gold, building things, banking. This is where the commerce was, because people were here wanting supplies. So there's all that kind of bustle going on. And I imagine that those streets around Dunedin, because it was very close to the water, and of course Jetty Street and Water Street, all of those were on the edge of the harbour, and all over where Logan Park is now was all big lagoon still. Yep. And South Dunedin would have been quite swampy still. Bell Hill would have still been a hill, was it?
They started knocking the top off that in the 60s, yeah.
In the 60s, yeah. So there would still have been quite a lot of obstacles around Dunedin as a place to get around in a muddy sort of streetscape.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. Horrors. Horrors.
And of course, then on top of the trams, we also get the cable cars.
Right.
In the 1880s. So.
And so the difference between a tram and a cable car?
Well, a tram goes on rails on the flat. They're initially pulled by horses. Sometimes they used steam trams as well, but they didn't last particularly long, and then went back to horses again. And then later on they were electrified too, of course.
Right.
And a cable car was pulled up and down the hill.
Right. And I think there was one...
With a cable.
So there was one at High Street, and another one where Stewart Street is?
Yeah, so the first one was the Roslyn cable car, which went up Rattray Street.
Right.
And then, so that's 1881. 1883, we get the Mornington system up High Street.
Yeah.
And then the third major system didn't get put in until 1900, and that's the one that went up Stewart Street.
Right. Oh, wow. So that was quite late.
Yeah.
Wow. And then the trams, I think, went all the way from Normanby, did they? Or am I just imagining that again?
Eventually the system went all the way from St Clair through to Normanby, yeah.
Right, yeah. So that's quite a comprehensive... And that was, you know, you had to pay to get on those, right?
Yep.
Have you any idea how much they cost?
Not off the top of my head, no.
Well, I have to look that up because I'm quite interested. This whole idea of tagging things to the Reserve Bank inflation thingy of the time and then just plugging it in, because you'll have records of that, I'm sure, in the Toitu. There'll be advertisements in newspapers and stuff, and it'll be saying how much it costs. And it would be really interesting, I think, to just compare over time how much it has cost to get from Normanby to the centre of town and then out to St Clair, and then just track that over time, because I reckon it's cheaper now than it was in the day.
I would say so, yeah.
I think it's much cheaper, and definitely cheaper to get to Dunstan than it was. $700 is a lot of money to get all the way to Dunstan. Interesting. Wow. Okay, so that's brought us right up. So we're coming through, and we've got walking and horses and trams, coaches, right through, and then you've got the rail coming in the early 70s there, 75 right through to 79, and at that stage you can kind of get around quite a lot, and then you sort of, I guess, get to the end of the railway line, and then you get a coach or something from there to the Queenstown or Wanaka. I don't think the trains never actually went through past. Did they go all the way to Cromwell at some stage?
Yeah, eventually, yeah.
Was the end of the rail line, wasn't it? And then I guess
by the time they got there, the age of motorcars had virtually arrived.
Had started, yeah. So do you know when the railway line got to Cromwell?
I want to say 1921 off the top of my head.
Yeah, so it's quite a bit later than the, like, getting to the Dunstan, like that. Those early ones, they were sort of 75, 78, 79. Everything was moving quite fast. And
79, they didn't start the central railway line until 79, and it was a long build.
Right. So you don't know how long that took to build that, 79?
It was built in stages, so I can't remember the dates of each stage.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. Fair enough. But it was taking longer than I'm imagining, because the first one was so quick. I was just like, that's amazing. But I guess they just were like, this is the one we really need. And then pumped everything into that. And then, as you're saying, by the time they got to that leg, actually all the way to Cromwell, didn't get used for very long. And then the motorcar comes in. So the first motorcars, so I guess there's kind of this plateau across the 70s, 80s and 90s where people are using a mixture of coaches and trains and still horses, and a lot of anyone who didn't have any amount of money was just walking around. So I think the majority of people still were probably walking around and using a horse and cart, really.
And then we get into the modern era where we've got the age of the motorcar and the age of electricity as well. So
they sort of come together.
Yeah.
And I guess also when you're talking about the motorcar, at the same time motorbikes would have come in at the same time as motorcars, because they were kind of contemporary there. People had already had. When did bikes come?
So 1860s.
Yeah, because I know there was walking.
The old bone shakers.
I know there was walking skirts going back to Victorian dress in the sort of 1870s, and of course you had walking skirts with a split in them so that you could ride a bicycle, and that was Queen Victoria's daughters were quite keen on, sport as it was then, which was tennis and cycling. And so I
sort of don't really talk about cycling as a mode of transport much, because initially it wasn't really a means of transport. It was more of a plaything.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that, because that would partly because there's no shocks, there's no springiness in the bike, so the bike is just really shaky. And of course, when you've got penny farthings and stuff, I mean, honestly, where are you going to get in a?
Although they did race them.
Of course, but as a mode of transport, trying to get from A to B on really muddy, not great roads, that would have been hard work.
Yeah, especially with the hills in Dunedin.
Yeah. So
we think of the likes of Christchurch being more of a cycling city than Dunedin. Yeah,
because it's flat. Some would say boring, but that's not me, folks out there. But so of course, like, even though the bicycle existed, it wasn't really a mode of transport. That's interesting. But then, of course, the motorbike is a whole different thing, right? Because by then you've got...
Well, not really, because... cycles evolved, and so we get to the safety bike, which is kind of the bike we know today, with the two wheels the same size, with the rubber tyres and that sort of thing. And then you slap a motor on it, you've got a motorbike.
Right. Yeah. And that's kind of coming in, right?
Right at the
1901,
turn of the
right on the
century.
turn of the century. And then there's some really interesting stuff because they come in as a curiosity more than anything to start with. I'm a rich person and I've bought a car. Look, this thing moves by itself. There's no horses attached to it. And there's, picnics and, the first trip to Waipori, and they've got people there who've never seen a car and everybody wants to go on it. And they had these picnics and the rides were free, but the demand was too much. They couldn't keep up with, so they had to charge a little bit of money to, recoup something.
That was the Early Settlers Association.
And this whole idea of it being it's just a thing that's amazing. There's this carriage without horses. And I guess, how did they even get the fuel? That's a whole part of their infrastructure that you don't even really think about. You would have to carry how much fuel you had, and you'd have to get it from somewhere. You don't buy it from a petrol station. Where do you get? I mean, I guess kerosene was around, but
well, it came in what was called flimsies, so the tins,
right?
And so bulk importation of fuel didn't start until the 1920s,
right?
So then you start getting more like the service station type arrangement, but
And so before that, you had to order your fuel from overseas?
I think you could get it from the likes of Cook Howlison and that sort of thing.
Right.
Cook Howlison, of course, was cycle dealers to begin with.
Yeah, so I didn't realise that until I started reading up on your amazing notes here. Yeah, so Cook Howlison, they started off as cyclists.
Yep.
Right, it's selling bicycles.
Yep.
And then, of course, slapped a motor on them.
Motor garages, yep.
Yeah, and then, of course, as soon as cars came in.
And there were a few others that were similar to that. Sam Steadman was a cyclist who opened a motor garage. So that's where you get your fuel from.
Yeah, and how did that interact with the roads? Because I think what really surprised me with the coaches, with Cobb & Co. and the rail, was they didn't even try and compete. The railway opened and they just sold everything out by auction, and the only places that the coaches were still going was where there wasn't a railway yet.
Yep.
And that, just looking at some of those auction notices, I was just like, nope, we're done. The railway's here, it's done. And there's not even any thought of competition. It was just instantaneous mode shift. But it wasn't quite like that with the motor car.
There was a bit of lead-in time, I guess you could say. First motor car in Dunedin was 1901, Thomas Kempthorne's locomobile. And by the middle of the First World War, there was still only 260-odd cars here. So
we're looking sort of 1915, 1916 there.
But after the First World War, it starts to take off. So by 1924, we've got nearly 950 cars.
Right. And I guess that was a lot of people coming back, having experienced driving in cars and tanks and the whole idea maybe. I don't know. Could just be time moving on.
And so you get all the infrastructure needs that grow up around that too.
Right.
So I've been looking a little bit recently at the 1925 exhibition at Logan Park.
Right.
And
so this is the South Seas exhibition, the great...
one of the greatest events in the history of Dunedin, really, which we'll be celebrating the centenary for next year.
Oh, right, yeah.
And they had a big motor pavilion there as part of the displays.
Yeah.
2 acres of cars, over 50 manufacturers.
Wow.
So obviously trying to flog off their cars and get more people to buy them. And
obviously a new and exciting and interesting thing, right? Yep. Because if you tried to propose for the centennium that we just have a whole lot of second-hand car dealers arrive there, that is not going to swing a centennium celebration. But obviously back then, car dealers, that was a great...
I just went to the Auto Spectacular a few weeks ago, so I guess that's a similar sort of thing to what they were doing at Logan Park 100 years ago. But as I say, it's a lot of infrastructure that needed to be built around it because you need to control the cars, control intersections. So you get police officers being stationed in intersections from the early 1920s and eventually being replaced by traffic lights.
Right.
So we get our first traffic lights in Dunedin here quite early.
When was that, do you know?
It was 1930.
Right.
So it was the corner of Lower Stewart Street and Cumberland Street.
Right. Big intersection, that makes sense. Coming down a hill.
But we only had one set of traffic lights for a long time. We didn't get any more until like the 1950s.
Oh, really? So like 20 years, and they were just like, one's enough for us, mate. But what really interested me was that they had to pass a special law to allow motor cars to go on the peninsula there, around to Portobello. That was interesting. Like, people were like, no, these are dangerous. They are driving way too fast. They're going like, 40k or something. And what are all the people that are walking along this track and going on horses and carts and things?
Dr. Fulton got called out there, and he got fined for taking his car out there, and so they had to lobby Parliament to.
They could have just made a special exemption just for doctors, right, or emergencies, but no, they wanted to lobby Parliament to change the rules. So, do you think that was like the turning of the tide, that where they said, okay, cars should be allowed to go everywhere?
Well, 1920s, they were kind of getting to a critical mass where they had to make a lot of changes like that, changes to legislation. And, and provision for parking was a big thing. At the exhibition, they built three off-street car parks.
Wow.
One was for the exhibitors and the directors, but the other two were
for the public
to park in.
Right. And were they paid parking?
They were, yeah.
See, people who want free parking everywhere, it's always been paid for.
So I think it was $1 for one of the car parks, and it was 1 6 for the other one, for the main one. And you could get fuel there. They were actually run by Sam Steadman, the garage proprietor. So he was selling fuel. He was. They had lunchrooms and left luggage offices and those sort of things.
Yeah,
so
and I imagine that you needed like mechanics as well.
Yep.
Grew up. One thing that really amazed me was the cars that I saw this at one of the vintage car clubs, where you could buy like all the parts except for the body. So you'd just get delivered the car, and there was like a set of instructions. So it's not even like IKEA where you get all the pieces and you just have to stick them together. But then you just go and get the boards and make the wooden frame for the car that goes around it. So you basically get, the axles and the wheels and the motor, but you don't get the body of the car. I mean, that's fantastic, really, isn't it? And then you sort of want, what was when warrant of fitnesses and registrations and things like that came into play?
Well, you had to register your car with the local authority to begin with.
Right.
It didn't become a national system until later on. Again, like in the 1920s, they were making these provisions. The Transport Department was set up in the late 1920s, and so we start to get a national system of law enforcement.
Right. And did that have speed limits and things in it?
Yeah.
Don't drive dangerously. Driving dangerously, that must have been one of the very first rules, mustn't it?
Yeah.
Because it's kind of like circumstance dependent, right? You're clearly driving too fast for this place.
But it was really subjective to begin with, right? Because
I imagine
you could tell somebody that they can't drive more than 4 miles an hour or something. But how do you know?
Right, because you've got no measuring of how fast is. Right. Yeah. Fast is too fast for the conditions. I don't know. But I did enjoy that there was one guy here, one of the very first ones, and I wondered if you knew about this, who I just did enjoy this. He did the first drive to Christchurch, I think, and his car blew up.
Oh, that was
burnt to the ground.
Yeah, I've forgotten his name.
Yeah, I've forgotten his name as well. But I just thought, oh gosh, because everybody goes on about electric cars and how, every now and again a battery blows up. But I was thinking, actual cars, that's the whole of action movie genre, isn't it? Things blowing up. And by and large, they're cars. I mean, sometimes it's trucks and planes, but by and large, they're, gasoline cars blowing up. So the whole thing of cars blowing up goes right the way back to the very beginnings of put fuel in something.
So that was one he'd built himself. Drove from
look, it's
from
right here on the first, 1900, first motor car, Denison Pioneering Motor. Drove from Christchurch to Oamaru on a gasoline-powered machine that he had built himself.
But on the way home,
it was capable of speeds 15 to 16 miles an hour under favourable conditions. I like how they add on the favourable conditions, because you're like, is that downhill on a smooth bit?
Good ride with a tailwind, yeah.
Goodness me. It was heralded in newspapers of the time as the first motorcar built in New Zealand. Unfortunately, on the return voyage from Oamaru to Christchurch, the car exploded. It and all of Mr. Dennison's luggage was burnt to cinders. Yeah. It's an early demise. But it didn't put people off, right? Because that's 1900. And then, they kept plugging away more and more different things. And right at the start, there were electric cars.
Yep.
And that's interesting. Have you got stories to tell us about the electric cars in Dunedin?
No, I don't know of any around here. Most of the very first cohort of cars here was steam.
Right.
Steam-driven cars.
And they were interesting as well because you didn't need a driver's licence to drive them. You needed an engineer's
certificate, yeah.
Which I think is fantastic.
Of course, all the people that owned them back then were the uber wealthy anyway, so that they could afford to employ somebody to drive them around.
Yeah, so they'd get a chauffeur who had an engineer's job. And I guess that's kind of, you're sort of talking just, sort of Downton Abbey type times, aren't you, when you're talking about the early cars? And those were the rich people.
James Mills was one of the
pushing laws to reform, and to make it so, cars can go where they want and there's going to be, right of ways and things, and then that's kind of, and then it's not until really after the First World War when you get more sort of probably still reasonably wealthy people, I would say, but not the uber wealthy.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit, that people are driving, then there's more of them as sort of 1,000 cars flying around the place, and then I guess what's the next big thing? Electrifying the trams. That was happening at about the same time in the 20s, right? So
1900, the first electric tram in New Zealand was here in Dunedin.
Oh, right.
So it's the one that ran along Highgate.
Right.
And then the city tramways electrified a couple of years later, and that's why Waipori Power Station was built to provide electricity
to power those.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
And then, of course, the trams and cable cars sort of reached their peak in the 10s and 20s, millions of passengers a year.
Right.
But then it starts to decline a wee bit. And
is that because more people have got cars, or why is that decline there?
A little bit to do with cars and buses sort of taking over as well. So going back to the exhibition at Logan Park, they put in a new tramway to actually go down there,
right,
to Logan Park, but they also put on 18 buses,
right.
So the DCC got its first bus in 1925. It was
right, and these are petrol buses,
yeah,
or
diesel,
yeah. Oh, 1925. 5. Wow.
But that wasn't the first bus in Dunedin. When the Elgin Road extension to the Mornington cable car was taken out in 1910, a couple of years later, the Mornington Borough Council bought a bus to service that area.
Oh, right. Okay, so it was actually borough councils that were doing it. It was a whole different political system then, actually, because the suburbs were more kind of delineated, I guess, and more kind of an encapsulated thing, and then the DCC was kind of more like the ORC is, I guess now, is kind of a broader area type thing. Yeah. Working with it. Interesting. And so then they had buses going to that South Sea. That South Seas exhibition, it must have been quite a huge tipping point for a lot of things, I imagine, just because it was all about showing off innovation and what's here, and it ran for a long time, didn't it? How long did it run for?
It ran from November 25 to May 26.
Yeah, so it's a reasonable sort of 6 month.
3.2 million visits in that time.
Yeah, which is well in advance of how many people were in New Zealand at the time.
It was double the population.
Yeah, and that would have been people coming from overseas as well.
Some of them,
coming to that. But I guess people also go multiple times.
They set up the first motor camp as well. To cater for the motorists and give them somewhere to stay.
Right, because people were coming from different places. Like people were driving down from Christchurch.
It was only open to motor club members.
Right.
And most of them were from outside of Dunedin, obviously, throughout New Zealand. A few from Australia, even some from South Africa came.
Wow. Yeah. Just to come to the South Seas exhibition. Amazing, eh? Fantastic. Okay, we've got 5 minutes left.
The only transition we perhaps haven't talked about is the buses going to trolley buses. In the 1950s.
I hadn't even thought about trolley buses. Tell us about trolley buses.
The trams and cable cars get phased out after the Second World War, and replaced by these electric trolley buses.
Right.
Which perhaps didn't last as long as people remember.
Why were they being? What was driving that phase shift? Because the trams and cable cars were still working. They were presumably being powered by electricity.
The system was getting pretty run down by that stage, though. They'd been going for 80 years,
What's the advantage of a trolley bus? I don't even understand what a trolley bus is. What's a trolley bus?
Well, it basically replaced the tram cars. It still runs using electricity fed from overhead wires.
Right.
Remember Dunedin back in the day, with all these overhead wires snaking all around the place.
So how's a trolley bus different from a tram?
Well, it's got wheels that don't run on rails.
Right.
Directly on the road.
Yeah. So
yep.
Trams run on rails and trolley buses, they still are fed from the overhead wires.
But they run on the road.
So they've got their own wheels.
Yep. So it doesn't take up as much space on the road because they're in the same roadway
Same road as the cars. So that they fit in better around the cars, I guess.
Yep.
Right. But because there's still countries around the world who have overhead electric trolley buses, I guess, but they don't call them trolley buses. They call them whatever they're called in Dutch, German, I suppose. I don't know what they are called.
So they sort of peaked in the 1960s.
Right.
They had a fleet of about 79 trolley buses by then.
And are there any of them left in existence? Like not running, but somewhere that you can go and look at one?
Of course, at the museum, of course. Our Tiger T trolley bus.
Right.
Another one of our transport icons.
He's looking at me crazy. That's the classic leading question, folks. Anyway, so you can go along. And trams, there are trams around Dunedin as well, aren't there? Where would you go to see a tram?
Again, you can come to the museum. So we've got the first electric tram car, the Roslyn No. 1.
Right.
And we've also got the cable car that used to run on the Maryhill line that was one of the last cars to run in 1957.
And, of course, the Josephine, the train.
We have.
Of course, the train.
Locomotive.
Oh, sorry, locomotive. Sorry, it's the locomotive. And motorcycles? Do you have any old motorcycles?
We
bikes?
do. We have a 1903 Clement Garrod, which...
right. That must have been quite early.
Yeah, they were ones that were sold by Cook Howelson.
Right.
And
does it still go?
It was restored by somebody a few years ago. It probably does, but we don't run things.
You don't run them; they just sit there. Okay, yeah. No. And of course you've got the Cobb and Co coach there as well.
We have
got the Cobb and Co coach there. So all those mode ships really encapsulated there. You can go along and have a look at any of them there.
You can indeed.
And they're all part of that on the move exhibition or associated. We'll just say associated because obviously Josephine just sits there as her own exhibition. No, that's fabulous. And interesting to know about those shifts and what sort of drove the changes between the shifts, I guess. And I guess the overriding kind of motif through it all is changes in technology coming. And then if it's useful, that technology, it's either... And mostly it's been private, hasn't it? Rather than... I mean, except for everybody got together and decided we needed a road going south and a road going north.
Yeah.
And then presumably someone of some authority paid those 400 folk to start building that road.
Provincial council, yeah.
Yeah, so I imagine that was more of a kind of top-down approach. And that kind of is the thing with putting in the infrastructure, isn't it? Is that roads and the railway lines, I don't know, do you know how they got paid or how they got decided where to go and who paid for them and how that was?
Oh, yeah. Contract system, yeah.
Were they put in by the regional council, by the district council or something? Or
they're private companies.
They were private companies putting in those railway lines for profit.
And then later on, the private companies get taken over in some instances by authorities.
Right.
Government or local government.
And I guess with the coaches as well, that was private companies, but of course the mail going through would have been private.
Post office.
So that was actually government, and that must have subsidised that coach system, I imagine, because you always get paid to take the mail through, and the policemen are obviously paid not by the private company but by the local government, and that gives, I imagine, the people who are on the coach a sense of security. So there is a sort of subsidised system happening with the coaches there, and it's possibly when that moves to the railway line, which would again been a step more secure for the local government moving things around in terms of both people taking stuff, but also in terms of them getting there in time for meeting deadlines and things. So that would have been actually kind of subsidised in the form that the security went with the mail, and the mail was always paid for. Yes,
a lot of private-public partnership sort of thing going on there.
Yeah, possibly not explicitly, but the public system was always kind of moving with things. And then, do you know, just quickly, with the infrastructure of the roads, when they were paid for by people or by the local government?
Well, I guess that from the beginning, the provincial government or provincial council
always
system
put the roads
was charged with putting a lot of the roads, and the local authority, the town authority for putting in streets and things.
Yeah. Hey, Peter, thank you so much for coming along. It's been absolutely amazing. A lot of things that I didn't know there, and contrary to your unwillingness to call yourself an expert, I think we can all agree that was very informative. And of course, there's always more information, more detail at the museum there at Toitu, and it's free entry. You can go along there anytime. Well, anytime it's open. And if you've been listening to this OI podcast and you enjoyed this episode with Peter Reid, we think you'll also enjoy the other episodes in our intermittent miniseries on Transport Modeshift, buses with Councillor Elliot Weir, and look out for the ferries with Rachel McGregor. That's coming soon. So delving into a little bit of those waterways. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to the OI podcast, the shout out for the arts, sciences and Mataranga Māori.
You can support this podcast by becoming a member of the OI. Check out the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences on Facebook or our website.
If you'd like to listen again to this episode or others from the series, look for the OI podcast on ORFM's website, oar.org.nz.
Brought to you by the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences, the Otago branch of the Royal Society of New Zealand.
This podcast was produced by ORFM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.